Last 10 years in the psychedelic space, what has been the biggest shift that you've seen in the conversation around psychedelics?
Yeah, it's a great opening question, Lance. So, about a decade ago in 2015, I started Third Wave as an educational platform, and so it's a perfectly fitted question because I was there really not from the get go, but from early enough where I saw how much stigma there was around microdosing and psychedelics. I observed there being just a lack of nuance in education in terms of what people understood about these powerful substances and in medicines. And I think it's been really great to see the tide change. In 2015, Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan, even Sam Harris were starting to talk more publicly about psychedelics, but still at that point in time, no states had legalized, no cities had decriminalized. These were Schedule One substances everywhere, totally illegal. And so when Michael Pollan published his book, How to Change Your Mind, in 2018, that was, really the big inflection point where folks came to realize, oh, if used with intention and responsibility, these substances can be really powerful allies for both healing, creativity, leadership, overall well-being. And so the biggest change in the last decade, I think, is just the destigmatization and education. I mean, even Cal Berkeley a couple of years ago published a study where they said 61% of Americans now support legal psychedelic therapy. That number was probably less than 20%
Mm.
just 10 years ago. So I think that shift and change is really massive because it opens the doorway to much broader conversations, not just how do we destigmatize these, but now how do we actually integrate these into healthcare, into business, into education, into these systems that could really benefit from intentional psychedelic use.
Yeah, and I think back to 2015. I always like to think about the time, what the conversations were, and there wasn't much going on with people didn't really know anything about it, right? It was still kind of the party, the recreational. It was kind of like this, you drink, eat mushrooms, drink, which is all fun and doing it, in that unconscious way. I think we've all done it. But yeah, it's really interesting to see and to witness how the conversation has evolved with psychedelics, with set and setting, and just it really being an intentional process and how much it changes the experience from it being, just, an escape, or something like that. And yeah, I can't imagine how much pushback or how much people must have gone after you at 2015 of, just a lack of education, right?
Right.
At that time.
Yeah. Well, because there's, with these being Schedule One substances, these other drugs that we perceive to be as harmful or just generally harmful, like heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, a lot of people, at least in those days, was lumping all of those together, right? There's no difference between psilocybin and heroin, or there's no difference between MDMA and cocaine. When in fact, when you get into the neurobiology and the clinical research, they're very distinct drug classes overall. And even this guy Richard Ehrlichman, who was an advisor to Nixon in the 60s when the war on drugs really started to take form, he was quoted as saying sometime later, we knew these drugs weren't harmful, but we couldn't make protesting illegal. And
Mhm.
so because all of these protesters in the 60s and early 70s were using, or many of them were using LSD, if we made the drugs that they were using illegal, well, then we could arrest them and crack down on these protests much easier. And so we're coming out of this, I would call it a 50-year brainwashing campaign specifically by the federal government. And unfortunately, that means millions of people have suffered because they haven't had access to these medicines. Because what a lot of people don't know is in the 50s and 60s, there were over 1,000 clinical papers published on the efficacy of psychedelics to treat a range of mental health conditions. And all of that was whitewashed to create this perception of these are dangerous, these are harmful, these are going to, fry your brain. These are going to ruin your life. When that can happen. I just want to be very clear.
Yeah.
There are, people have definitely gone off the deep end. There are certainly risks involved with psychedelics, but for the most part, these are ancient substances that have been used for thousands of years. And they do require containers. They require intention. They require ritual. They require a sense of reverence and sort of sacredness with it. And I think that's really what we're trying to do with Third Wave is how do we balance the sort of scientific underpinnings of these with the ancient ceremonies and rituals that have held these medicines for thousands of years.
Yeah, I love it, man. And I think it's so important. And you've been a pioneer in this space, which is because, you have a lot of really, really valuable information. And I think I learned first about your stuff. I was in Fit for Service, Aubrey Marcus. Were you in that? Were you in?
Oh yeah.
Okay, I was in
but one of my former business partners was in the inaugural.
Okay, I was in 2020. So I remember that actually just came to me. I was like, when did it come online? When did I first learn about Third Wave? And I remember people talking about it in the chat as it being a really good resource because everybody was talking about psychedelics. That's where I first learned about the intentional aspect of it, not just recreational. Going and sitting with ayahuasca, I got to sit with Aubrey and Vi, and I did psilocybin, and it really changed my perspective on everything. And I think having a resource like you have there is really, really important because there is a fine line, right? Between, using it as a tool or as a medicine or, at least educating yourself on that versus it just being another addictive behavior. Like this is kind of what I want to talk about too, is like, where do we draw the line? Like what is too much, like, cause you see this and I have personal opinions around, I see certain people. I'm like, man, like, why do you keep doing, have you even integrated what you've learned, but then there's like, well, that's their experience. That's their personal journey. But where do you see that? And how do you talk to people about this? Like, where is that line between medicine and, overboard, recreational kind of thing?
Yeah, there's a few ways I would think about that. I think, the first way is which drug or medicine is being utilized, right? And so we have ketamine, we have MDMA, we have psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, ayahuasca, 5-MeO DMT. Ibogaine has been getting a lot of press lately because of its. There was a recent bill passed in Texas where they're funding Ibogaine research with $50 million. And so what I've noticed most often, ayahuasca as well as you've mentioned, what I've noticed most often is there are particular substances that tend to be more prone to overuse or addictive behavior. And I think the two most prevalent are ketamine and MDMA. Ketamine is a legal dissociative anesthetic. It's been used in emergency rooms since the 1950s. It now has clinical research and it's been FDA approved to treat depression in particular. And a lot of folks who start this pathway with psychedelics often start with ketamine because they just want to feel better. But what I've noticed in, social circles, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, is people will sort of sit on this high horse of, oh, I don't drink alcohol, but, they're snorting, nasal ketamine at every party.
Yeah.
And so I think ketamine in particular it can be very powerful and very useful, but it also can be easily abused and become addicted to. So I think that's the first distinction. I think MDMA as well, because it is such a feel-good love drug, like we saw the rise of MDMA in the late 70s, early 80s, it was actually legal for about a decade. And it was used by a lot of underground therapists in relationship work in particular. And then in Dallas in the early 1980s, it caught on in the rave scene. And so now we know MDMA is ecstasy. And the reason it was made a Schedule I substance in 1985 was because it was being abused in a lot of these rave and festival scenes. And so I think MDMA also, because of its neurotoxicity, you have to be careful with it. It can be very powerful for relationship work. MAPS has brought MDMA through clinical trials. We know it's really useful at healing PTSD and, other clinical conditions, but I do think it can lend itself to some abuse. And then when we look at things like mushrooms, ayahuasca, 5-MeO DMT, there's a line there, right? And what I've noticed is a lot of people who are really struggling, like they're really suffering, they may start their path with psychedelics, with ayahuasca or mushrooms, and maybe they go and sit in a ceremony or an experience once a month for 12 months, right? And some people would look at that from the outside and being like, that's too much, like you're overdoing it. And maybe for that person, it's actually what's needed to really start to open up some channels and see a significant change. And then there are people I know who have been drinking ayahuasca for 20 years, and really not much has actually fundamentally changed about their behavior. So I think this really comes down to leveraging what I call the critical learning period, which is the neuroplasticity that comes online when we work with a high dose of a psychedelic. For about a month after that high dose of a psychedelic, we can actually repattern a lot of our behaviors that we may have insights or awareness to when it comes to our psychedelic work. And so that's where integration is so key. And I think one of the reasons that we see the overuse of these medicines is because our normal waking day reality is so distinctly different from these sacred ceremonial spaces. And so a lot of people come back into this, smoking 5-MeO or drinking ayahuasca or taking high doses of mushrooms because they're seeking a sense of the sacred and they're seeking a sense of deep connection. And we just don't have a world that's built for that. And so I think a lot of the work now is, as we have so many people who are waking up through psychedelic work, it's not just the waking up, but it's how do you actually clean up and then show up. And I think that's still unfolding. So is doing a mushroom ceremony or drinking ayahuasca once a month for 2 or 3 or 4 years healthier than, blacking out on alcohol? No doubt, right? Like these are better choices. And I do think now that we're a decade in, the next decade, I'm really curious about how do we actually integrate these substances within our lives so the impact that we individually have can start to bubble into, our healthcare systems and educational systems and, how we approach work and how we approach family and relationships. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that vein.
Yeah. And having people that are educated on how to navigate the integration space like you guys do, right? And I think it's so important because it's so nuanced and there's just so much going on, and sometimes it's just too much too soon, too fast for people. And you come back to the 3D world and it's like, well, how do you make sense of it all? And
Right.
I think it's so important to have tools, even breath work, meditation, journaling, and just people that understand the landscape, especially somebody that's kind of new to it, right? And and I kind of wanted to, obviously microdosing too has been something that is just so powerful. And I know that your experience in the beginning getting into psychedelics was with LSD, right? Can you maybe just talk to us about, I don't have a lot of LSD experience. Like that's one thing that I've I'll admit, I'm like, fuck, this shit kind of scares me a little bit. And which means maybe I need to lean into that. But I would love if you could speak to that a little bit, and then we can maybe talk about the microdosing.
Yeah. So probably everyone who's listening to this has heard of LSD. The formal name is lysergic acid diethylmide. It was invented in 1938 in Switzerland by Albert Hofmann. He discovered its psychedelic properties in 1943. And on April 19, 1943, had the first LSD experience where he took what he thought was a very small dose, 1/4 milligram, which is 250 micrograms. And he went on this full-blown journey and saw both hell and heaven, right? And I think that encapsulates LSD pretty well, that at these higher doses, which I would categorize as anywhere from 100 micrograms to 1,000 micrograms, if not more, it can be a very intense psychedelic experience. And especially as you go higher in dosage, so 250, 300, 500, the likelihood that that sort of turns into a challenging experience or a bad trip becomes that much more likely, because the psyche is just getting opened up
Yeah.
so much. And so a lot of the horror stories that I hear with LSD are people who just, take a couple tabs of acid and, they're at Burning Man, or they're at a festival, or, maybe they're just even hanging out with a friend and they're like, this sounds fun. Like, let's just take a bunch of acid and see what happens. And unfortunately, it's such a potent substance that at these very high doses, it's a razor thin line between a beautiful mystical experience and a very difficult experience. Thankfully, my early experiences with LSD were anywhere in that 100 microgram to 200 microgram range, which is, a substantial dose. It's not a microdose. It was an altered state of consciousness. And I was almost always outside in the woods with a friend or a couple close friends in a place that I knew well, a place that I'd hiked a bunch, a place that felt safe. And so I was really able to drop in. And for me, the biggest thing was this deep connection and reverence and love for nature, for the trees and the beach and the water, and, just sort of Mother Nature. And so as I've gotten deeper into understanding LSD and talking about LSD, educating people about LSD, it feels like this microdose level, which is 10 to 20 micrograms, so about a tenth of a regular dose. This microdose level seems to be ideal for most people. And so oftentimes when folks come to me and they're like, I've heard a lot about LSD, I'm scared, I say, just start low and go slow, right? Like, you can take 10 micrograms or 20 micrograms and you're going to notice it a little bit. It'll be subtle but present. Your mood will improve. You'll have more energy. You might sleep a little better. These are some of the clinically established benefits of microdosing. But rather than jumping in the deep end right away and sort of flipping a coin about what might happen, I do think it's helpful to start at these lower doses, develop a relationship with this substance or medicine. And then if you wish to go deeper, right, you're like, okay, I'd like to try a full tab now. Do it with a friend that's experienced, in a place that feels comfortable. Make sure you have a playlist, make sure you have a grounding practice. You can go outside and just have your feet in the ground, or, have a little breath work or meditation, something that can help you to stay grounded in, this high dose experience with LSD.
What is actually happening? Like, I love to, because people, may not really understand what's going on in the brain and why is it healing? Like, what is actually happening there?
So there's a incredible, there's a lot here. We could probably spend the whole conversation talking about the neuroscience of psychedelics. It's one of my favorite kind of nerdy topics to go into. So there's a psychedelic neuroscientist, Dr. Robin Carhart Harris, who I highly recommend folks check out after this podcast. I've done a podcast with him. He's been on Andrew Huberman. He's been on, a lot of the major podcasts. And about 10 years ago, he did fMRI scans with high doses of LSD and psilocybin. And LSD and psilocybin are what we call the classic psychedelics. Right. The technical term is serotonergic agonists. And so the classic psychedelics are the lysergamides, the tryptamines, and phenethylamine. And so the most well-known phenethylamine is mescaline, which is the active alkaloid in peyote, and San Pedro, the sort of psychedelic cacti. So those are the classic psychedelics. They all interact in fairly similar ways in the brain. They activate something called the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, which is tied to the prefrontal cortex and the activation of the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that really distinguishes us from mammals as human beings. It's, where our ability to communicate, our ability to plan, our ability to strategize, our ability to have that higher level of consciousness really comes from the prefrontal cortex. And so when they had these individuals take high doses of psychedelics and sit in an fMRI scanner, which I would not advise unless you are really keen to be a psychonaut in that way, just because I can't imagine what that would be like. But what they found is there were a couple key things going on. One is that there was greater neural connectivity between both hemispheres of the brain. And so when our brain is really young, like 5 years old, our left and right hemisphere are very active, right? And that's why we're more creative, we're less filtered. The brain is in development, we're learning different patterns of behavior, language, music, right? The brain is like a sponge in that way. It's very malleable. But as we get older, a lot of these neural pathways get set. And for most of us who live in the industrial West, we tend to over-index on the left hemisphere, which is the linear, the ability to get things done, the ability to stay focused, the ability to make sure we can handle our day-to-day. And that right hemisphere of the brain, which is our more artistic or creative side of the brain, start to sort of shut down. And so when we do this high dose of psychedelics, it reactivates more of that right hemisphere of the brain by the greater neural connectivity. And that's helping to facilitate what we would call neuroplasticity. Right. And so a lot of times as we grow older, there are neural pathways that start to shut off or die down because we're no longer using them. Right. This phrase, use it or lose it, is very salient for brain health. Right. It's why even when we talk about how do we prevent Alzheimer's and dementia, there's often talk about, well, play an instrument or learn a language or be active or do Sudoku, or, it really helps to keep the brain stimulated and activated. And so psychedelics do that. And the best metaphor that I've heard to describe sort of what it does comes from Mendel Kaelin, who's a neuroscientist in the UK. And this metaphor was described really well in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. And it's essentially, for these neural pathways, you could think of it like a snowboard resort or a ski resort, where when there's no fresh powder, you're just following the same tracks that everyone else is following. But when there's a fresh layer of snow that comes down on a powder day, you can go out there and you can start to really carve new tracks and explore a lot more. And so when we take a psychedelic, it's like, there's a massive powder day on the mountain. And all of a sudden, when we go back into our normal everyday life, when we're in that critical learning period or the integration phase, we now have more choice and agency to make new choices and decisions that we think are actually best for us, that don't come from a previous trauma or conditioning or just the way that we've always done things. And so psychedelics often introduce what's called entropy into the brain. And that entropy is really helpful to establish those new habits and patterns and whatnot.
I love that metaphor. I remember when I heard that. I'm glad you told that, because that is such a great way to kind of make it easy for somebody to understand. So talk about the prefrontal cortex. This is something that I find really interesting because I was a hockey player. I was an athlete. I got a lot of head injuries. So last time I had a brain scan, I think it was like 2018, my prefrontal cortex was only operating 4 out of 10. Like it was, Whoa. Yeah. So I think a lot of athletes can relate to how important this is, from getting hit in the head, body checks, fights, partying, all that shit. And what I have found is microdosing psilocybin has been really helpful. And it's interesting because like we were talking, I was in Southeast Asia for 9 months and was on nothing, right? A little bit of lion's mane. And I have a buddy here who started a company, Mindful Meds, in Canada. Great guy. Definitely connect you, Keegan. And this is why it's funny. It's timely conversation, because I just started on the microdose again. And it's like my brain, it's like my moods, and it's like this like fog, or like this, it's like ding, like things are turned on again or something. And it's just so powerful to see the shift in just well-being and concentration and focus and all of that. And I know that you must talk to a lot of athletes, right? With similar experience. Can you maybe like walk us through maybe what's going on and how microdosing with psilocybin, or that's all I know. I've microdosed a little bit of LSD by accident. I didn't even know. I was taking a friend's thing at her house, and I was like, shit, I had no idea, and it helped me a lot. But intentionally, mushrooms, I could really, really notice it.
Mm. Yeah. So Daniel Carcio is probably the best spoken on this. We've had him on the podcast. He's a former Stanley Cup champion with the Chicago
He was an
Blackhawks,
animal.
car
He
bomber.
was an animal
Yeah.
out there, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just so everybody
And
knows.
if you look at before, total animal. If you look at before and after photos, it's insane the change.
Yeah.
That's come about because of his not just microdosing, but higher dose psychedelic use as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about some clinical research that's been done on ibogaine in particular, because I think this will be a great reference point. And then I could talk about how that relates to psilocybin
For sure.
as well and microdosing. So there's a group that's done a lot of psychedelic work, specifically ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT with special ops and ex-NFL athletes and also some ex-NHL athletes. And what they've shown with that clinical research, this was published out of Stanford by a medical doctor, a psychiatrist named Nolan Williams. And they showed that after one single treatment of ibogaine, just one treatment, all 30 of those special ops vets healed their traumatic brain injury.
Wow.
And so it was a single treatment that healed the traumatic brain injury. And because of that impact on the brain in particular and brain health and some of the support that was provided, there was therapeutic support before and after as well. There was an 80% plus reduction in symptoms of depression, addiction, anxiety, and PTSD. Right. And so by healing the brain and the TBI, and we see this, there's a lot of conversation around the NHL, but especially the NFL now with CTE, that if your brain is not healthy, it's really difficult to function. There's mood destabilization, there's outbursts, there's the inability to be able to handle day to day. And we also see this with vets. We have over 20 veterans who commit suicide every day right now. And so knowing that these can be useful and helpful in just one single treatment, I think is very powerful. Now, psilocybin's a little bit different than ibogaine. I'm not going to go into all the distinctions. I don't think we have the time for that. But psilocybin is a little shorter lasting. Ibogaine can last up to 24 hours. Psilocybin is more like 6 hours, but it's a lot of the same mechanism of action that's going on, which is helping to reduce neuroinflammation. And by reducing neuroinflammation, it's allowing these neural pathways to regrow or sort of reactivate again. And so what we've seen in a lot of clinical research is psilocybin helps to regrow what are called dendrites. And dendrites are these little kind of spindly things at the end of neurons. And by helping to regrow dendrites, those neural pathways can start to form again and take place. And so if we look at microdosing then within that, a really good metaphor or a way to think about it is with a high dose of a psychedelic, it's like a massive injection of energy into the brain, right? It really helps to reopen those neural pathways. Microdosing is, it does something very similar. It's just at a lower dose level, right? And so what we see oftentimes with microdosing protocols with these ex-athletes or folks who have had traumatic brain injury is they'll start with, let's say, a high dose journey where they might do 2 or 3 or 4 grams of psilocybin because it's catalytic. It gets them out of that rut. It gives them hope and inspiration and faith that they can really change. And then microdosing they'll do in the 4 to 6 to 8 to 12 weeks afterwards as a way to continue to feed those neurons new fertilizer, right? And so that consistent activation of the 5-HT2A receptor, which I referred to earlier, helps the prefrontal cortex to heal and come back into its natural state. One other note that I'll make on that, there has been some early clinical research. There was a paper published a month or 2 ago about psilocybin for Parkinson's. And so even though we have a lot of clinical data on the efficacy of psychedelics for PTSD, depression, addiction, anxiety, a lot of that is well established now, I think the next really exciting forefront for psychedelic research is its impact on neurodegenerative diseases, which would include TBI, but also Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, MS, potentially. And so if we look at like the next 10 years, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, I think what I'm most excited about is the the amount of research that's now being done where we're discovering that, psychedelics can help with Lyme disease. They can help with autoimmune conditions. They can help with pain. They can help with degenerative diseases. And like, this is a lot of what I spend my time focused on. They can help you to be more creative. They can help you to be, a better partner or spouse. They can help you to be a better leader and communicator. So I think there's also a lot of potential there when it comes to psychedelics, not just for healing clinical conditions, but really helping people to live their best life, so to say.
Would you say then that that would be replacing the pharmaceuticals with psilocybin? Obviously that would be how that switch would happen, right? Or how do you see it really becoming mainstream like that, where people, that's the go-to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So an interesting stat, 50 million people last year were prescribed SSRIs in the United States. 50, right? That's nearly a sixth.
That's insane.
Of our population. It's totally insane. We've only known about SSRIs for 40 years or so. They were invented in the early 1980s. And a lot of the research that's now coming out shows that SSRIs, when you're looking at broad population, is actually no better than placebo. Now, we also know there are tens of millions of people who are also prescribed mood stabilizers like Wellbutrin, antipsychotics, benzodiazepines for anxiety, Ritalin and Adderall for ADHD. And the fundamental truth about literally all of these psychiatric drugs is the withdrawal symptoms when you try to get off of them are horrendous. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times folks will just go on it thinking, okay, I can go on it for 3 or 6 months, it'll help, but they can't get off of it because it's so difficult to handle the withdrawal. And so I think at a fundamental level, ketamine is a really great stopgap in that, because the way that ketamine interacts with the brain is a different system than, for example, SSRIs. And so there are a lot of people who are starting to do ketamine therapy as a way to help with those withdrawals and to get off SSRIs. I think in the next 10 years, what you'll see is those drug classes will still be prescribed, SSRIs and ADHD medications. But as more education and research comes out around especially low doses of psychedelics like microdosing, because it's a little bit like comparing apples to oranges with typical psychiatric medications and MDMA therapy or psilocybin therapy or this high dose work. It's a totally different paradigm and lens. But the low dose stuff it sort of falls somewhere in between. And so I think we'll see millions of people as these microdoses get clinically approved by the FDA switching to psilocybin or LSD or mescaline-based psychedelics, because in my fundamental belief, they're just as, if not more effective than a lot of these psychiatric medications, and they don't have nearly the same level of negative side effects, withdrawal symptoms. I think a lot of question that people have when they start microdosing is, if I microdose 3 or 4 times a week and then I stop, am I going to have any withdrawals? And the fact is there's no physical withdrawals. Some people get a little psychologically attached to it because they're like, okay, I'm feeling better, and do I need to keep microdosing to feel better? And it may be for some time that you do, but physiologically there's no withdrawals with it as well. And so my big hope is that within a decade, psychedelic medicine will be, compared to some of these psychiatric medications, the hope is that within 10 years, we can switch those numbers, because currently there's, I think, about last year in the United States, 8 million people took mushrooms, which is still substantive. It's about 3% of the population, but it's 10x that in terms of the number of people on psychiatric meds. I would love if we can reverse that. And then I think the greater hope is that by working with psychedelics in an intentional way, it actually eliminates the need to continue to be on a medication, right? Like we should be building lives, both for the collective, but also for ourselves, that don't require us to take a pill just to get through the day. I think that's the ideal. And so my hope is that as we look at integrating psychedelics more broadly, that we can create systems that are really supportive of human, mental health and human flourishing, and, don't keep people on a pill for the rest of their lives. I think it's really unfortunate that that's the sort of dominant paradigm right now.
Yeah, it's really fascinating and crazy that we got to this point. Like, if you really zoom out and go, well, wouldn't it make sense to just find the root of the reason why you need to put the band-aid on? Like, because it's just a band-aid. It's like, why not get to the root? And the psychedelics get to the root of it, or any sort of inner work. Like, why not figure out, okay, sure, like this thing is here, but like why? Like what's the root of, let's like figure that out. The root cause, just like in nutrition, right? It's like, but you say that to some people and oh, that's woo woo, that's quackery. It's like, is it though? Like how did we get here? That's what blows my mind. And it just makes me wonder as well, like, and I'm curious to hear about this because I see this a lot. And people are talking, and I've even seen your posts about it as well. I think it was yours, but
Mm-hmm.
about the legalization and
Mm-hmm.
like what are the downsides of that? Because there, yeah, that's great, but then what happens? Like is that like, is that going to be something where they end up, like, I always get curious about, well, if it is fully legal, then what happens? What are your thoughts on all that? Like, because there's so much bullshit going on, man. Right?
Yeah, it's a good question. We have a practitioner training program for coaches and doctors and therapists. It's about a 10-month training program. And so we've trained about 300 practitioners now. And so it's been interesting to see as they've gone out into the wild and actually worked with people, sometimes in states where it's legal, like Oregon and Colorado, but oftentimes in the underground in California, New York, Austin, Miami, Vancouver, they're doing underground work. And I think a big part of the challenge around psychedelics is still the illegality. And this comes back to set and
Yeah.
setting, right? That a lot of the sort of lack of trust or potential paranoia is I'm doing something illegal, right? And I have to sort of sneak
Right.
around to be able to get access to this. And so I think one of the greatest upsides to these states and potentially the FDA approving certain psychedelic medicines is it creates a set and setting that's much more wholesome, that's much more honest, that's much more sort of encapsulating for what the experience needs to be, rather than it being this sort of illegal thing that I have to go to my local guy to get access to, right? So I think that's number one. I think number two is we're already seeing somewhat of a legal market, if you
Mm.
will. So you mentioned this friend of yours who has mindful meds. We have another partner that we work with called Golden Rule. There are several other microdosing companies or companies that are selling chocolates where it's a bit of the Wild West out there right now, right? And so a few years ago, I started a nonprofit called the Microdosing Collective, which is a 501c3, where we're advocating for states to legalize microdoses of psychedelics so people can get access to
Mm.
them. Because a big part of the risk right now is if you go online or just go to a local person and you get a chocolate bar, or you get some microdosing supplements, you actually don't know what's
Yeah.
in it. There's no third party testing, there's no consumer protection, right? And so I think another thing that legality does is it ensures it like creates more trust. It ensures that people really know what they're getting, they know the amount that they're getting, they know both the benefits and the risks of it. Um, and then I think outside of that, I go back to what I was mentioning with creating a world in which we don't all have to be on medication
Yeah.
necessarily, right? And so it's not going to be a simple, straightforward way to do this, right? It's going to take decades, probably 20 or 30 or 40 years for this to really unfold. But I do believe by creating more legal access in states like Colorado and Oregon that have already legalized psilocybin mushrooms, New Mexico recently medicalized psilocybin for clinical use. There are 5 other states right now that have bills on the floor looking to do the same thing. I think by creating that context, it just helps to create more accessibility so people can have access to this. And I do think there will be abuse, there will be bad trips, there will be negative experiences, there will be people who have a difficult time. And so it's really important that we welcome those voices as well, that we don't just try to shut those off, that those are really great intel in terms of, well, how do we do this better? Right. And I think if we can wake up every day with an understanding that the cat's out of the bag, that psychedelics are happening, that this is going to become legal and accessible. And the next question is, how do we reduce harm? How do we make sure that when people are doing this, they're not just jumping in the deep end and they have no idea how to swim? that they're educated properly, that they have a great doctor or therapist or coach who can support them, and that they don't just see this as a magic
Mm.
pill. Because I think part of the tension is we have been so conditioned to believe that if we just take a pill, it'll fix our problem. And I think what's true about psychedelics is if you buy the ticket and you take the ride, it doesn't do the work for you. It shows you certain insights and ahas and perspectives, but you still have to show up in that integration phase and actually make the difficult and hard changes in your day-to-day life. And I think that requires a lot of courage, to do. It's not always easy to really pull the plug or divorce a spouse or quit your job or move where you're living or get out of that abusive relationship or whatever it is. And so this community support, I think, is necessary, right? We really need people around us who are walking that path, who have done this before us and are willing to support us in that process.
Yeah, it's so important, man. Now let's talk. I know we're getting ready to wrap up here, but there's something I wanted to definitely cover. I'm glad it came to me just now. And it is us relying on AI. Like, obviously AI is a great tool. Like, I think a lot of people understand that, but a lot of it is we're outsourcing our creativity, little things. I'll speak for myself, little things that maybe I would have thought about on my own, or at least got the wheels moving to like try something without it. But now kind of outsource it, which means less going inward, less intuition. How can we figure out that balance? Because like you said, if you don't use it, you lose it. And the intuition is one of those things too, man, where as an entrepreneur, you really got to be able to tune in and feel in. And for me, it's breath work, meditation. It's been forefront. And now even with psilocybin, it just adds that extra little bit, because it's so easy to get caught up in I'll just ask the AI everything, or I'll just use AI. And even when it comes to writing books, like I wrote my book, I published in 2022. And if I would have had AI, it would have been a completely different experience. I'm glad that happened before when I was still like that. I'm glad I went through that hard process of no AI. So where do you stand with all that, man? How do we use psychedelics as like kind of bridging the gap between the two so that we still keep the humanness, intuition, but also maximize the tech?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, LSD sort of brought us to AI. And what I mean by that is, LSD was one of, if not the most influential thing in the development of Silicon Valley in the 1960s and 70s. And many people have heard about Steve Jobs and LSD. And so from that came the personal computer revolution. From that came the internet. Right. And now from that, I think, is coming blockchain and AI. So I think it's similar to how have we used smartphones. It is a different bear, AI is, but smartphones have been built to be intentionally addictive, to keep us occupied in that headspace, to keep us checking and in this sort of sympathetic state. And so it does require a lot of agency to put your smartphone down, to not check it first thing in the morning, to have, let's say, a healthy relationship with it. I think our relationship with AI will be similar, but more amplified. I do believe it is a very helpful tool. We're using it a lot internally for our team now, and it's really made a lot of stuff much easier. And my sort of optimistic hope is that AI can start to handle a lot of this sort of white collar knowledge work, this linear work that we feel we have to do just to keep ourselves busy, but in actuality, we don't feel really inspired or motivated by it. And so my optimistic hope is that if we can use this as a tool and use it responsibly, then artificial intelligence can actually create a lot of freedom for us to really be a human being rather than a human doing, and actually step fully back into what I would consider to be our fundamental birthright, which is as a creator. And what I've noticed about working with AI is if you have the context for it, it can be really good at knocking things out. It also can be a helpful brainstorming partner going back and forth. But I find true creativity, like true, let's say, quantum breakthroughs in how we approach life or business, really still must come from that internal landscape. And so I think having the ability to balance those, where we understand sort of the right utility for AI, And we ideally have cultivated so much sovereignty and freedom in our own sense of being that it is impossible not to come back to that place and really connect with ourselves and ask ourselves, what is it that I want? What is it that I want to create? How is it that I want to live? How do I want to be of service? I think another great opportunity that AI opens up is it's hopefully going to create more, I would call it like energetic space for us to focus on things that we love to do, focus on healing the environment, taking care of the environment, working on art or creative projects, not just to make a buck, but actually because we think it's nourishing and supportive of life itself. And so it'll be interesting to see, where we stand in another decade. Like if we have this podcast another decade from now, it'll be interesting to see, okay, how did this all play out? Like, did AI take over as the new intelligence? I don't really fully buy this sort of apocalyptic scenario. I think it's just a projection of our inner shadow. I don't
Love that.
really attach to it, but I do think it's going to be a whole new world when AI becomes more integrated, just like it was a whole new world when the internet became integrated.
Yeah.
Like the way that we live now compared to the way that we lived in the 80s and 90s, it's quantum in terms of the changes that have taken place.
Absolutely, man. Dude, where can everybody find you? Tell us what you got going on. I know you got coaching, putting people through the coaching. Tell us what you got going on.
Yeah, so thethirdwave.co, or just Google third wave psychedelics or third wave microdosing. Thethirdwave.co is our main educational platform. I have a podcast. We have guides, lots of free resources and education for people to go deeper into this. We also have a training company called the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. We have a level 1 training, which is around microdosing for nervous system regulation. And then our level 2 training, which is about prep and integration coaching for doctors, therapists, coaches who want to work with high doses with clients. So if there's any folks who are interested in going deeper into this path and maybe supporting themselves or supporting other clients, I'd say go to thethirdwave.co, check out some of our resources, and then psychedeliccoaching.institute is our training platform.
Awesome. Dude, thank you so much, man. Could talk to you for hours about this. What you're doing is so important. And man, I can't wait to see, what else you guys, keep creating and just evolving, and just what you're doing is awesome. So thanks so much.
Thank you, brother. It was great to be on, and I'm glad we got a little chance to drop in.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.